And we'll be back with more world news. And from breakingnews.ie, Boris Johnson criticizes new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland. Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has criticized the new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland, arguing it's not about the UK taking back control and suggesting he'll not vote for the plan. Mr. Johnson said he'd find it very difficult to support the Windsor Agreement and vote in the UK's House of Commons, despite claiming some credit for the new pact. In a combative speech in Westminster, Mr. Johnson said he hopes the DUP leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, restores power sharing to Northern Ireland, but he raised numerous concerns about the New Deal with the European Union, saying, "I'm conscious I'm not going to be thanked for saying this, but I think it's my job to do so. We must be clear about what's really going on here. I'm going to find it very difficult to vote for something like this myself," he said. This is not about the UK taking back control, and although there are easements, this is really a version of the solution that was being offered last year to Liz Truss when she was Foreign Secretary. This is the EU graciously unbending to allow us to do what we want to do in our own country, not by our laws, but by theirs. Mr. Johnson called for his controversial Northern Ireland Protocol bill, which the EU argued would breach international law, to be restored if the New Deal does not work out. I'm going to find it very difficult to vote for something like this myself. I hope that it will work, and I also hope that it doesn't work. We'll have the guts to employ that bill again, because I've no doubt at all that it's what brought the EU to negotiate seriously, he says. And from politics.co.uk, splitting and under siege, the DUP faces a Brexit showdown like no other. The discussion on Northern Ireland Protocol has changed subtly in recent days, and just because Brexiteers have new lingo by way of the Windsor Agreement to brandish, rather both the substance and terror of the debate, or the tenor of the debate, have shifted dramatically because the Prime Minister appears to have negotiated a better deal with the EU than many were expecting. In response to the new red lane, green lane trading regime sweetened by a Stormont break, there have been no resignations, no stinging intervention from Boris Johnson, barely a whisper from the European Research Group of Eurosceptic conservatives. That former Brexit negotiator, Lord David Frost, has emerged as a cautious supporter of the framework, a serious coup for the PM, and a microcosmic signal of the improved mood music. But the terms of the protocol's resolution success were always more multifaceted than bettered relations within the Conservative Party. A rather more important yardstick is what extent the deal contributes to the resumption of power sharing in Northern Ireland, shunting the Democratic Unionist Party back to Stormont in time for the 25th Good Friday Agreement's anniversary on 10 April. In May 2022, the DUP withdrew from Stormont, citing their fervent opposition to the Northern Ireland Protocol as negotiated by Boris Johnson. The unblinking standoff has incapacitated politics in the 6 counties, and to a lesser extent the UK as a whole ever since. And from newsletter.co.uk, Jamie Bryson, Windsor deals must be rejected, but its core parts could be restructured within a constitutionally acceptable framework. On Monday, the Windsor framework was published. Since then, I personally, alongside colleagues from the Center for the Union and others, studied the relevant materials, the most crucial of which is the legal text contained within the draft decision of the EU-UK Joint Committee. The first thing to say, and this again is from Jamie Bryson, the first thing to say is that I'm not sure whether the Joint Committee is even empowered to make such far-reaching amendments to the withdrawal agreement of which the protocol is part. That, however, is besides the point for present purposes. It was obvious to me relatively quick that the right answer was as to whether unionism should endorse the deal. However, such a detailed and complex series of interlocking texts warranted rigorous examination, and as such I've reserved judgment until today when I've written this article for the newsletter and published a more extensive 1,600-word piece on the Unionist Voice website. In common with the protocol itself, the government and the Prime Minister himself says they're doing one thing, but the legal text does another. It was claimed, for example, that the customs border in the Irish Sea had been removed. It did not. Indeed, Article 9.2 of the draft decision of the Joint Committee makes clear that even for the Green Lane, information is required to be provided for customs purposes. That confounds the pronouncements of the Prime Minister and the government's own command paper. Moreover, whilst the command paper and the Prime Minister, both in Parliament and writing in the newspaper, proclaim their commitment to the Acts of Union, there is absolutely no legal text which in fact frees the Acts of Union from the present subjugation. That's unsurprising because the Windsor framework is incompatible with the Acts of Union. There's not even a credible argument that it is not. That answer is simple. EU law continues to apply in trade. GBNI is on different footing that, for example, trade from England to Scotland. That is, EU law continues to apply in trade. Great Britain to Northern Ireland is on a different footing than, for example, trade from England to Scotland. It follows that sacred principle which bound together the anti-protocol campaign and to which every unionist party has expressly committed is the Acts of Union. It's the first of the DUP's 7 key tests. Those tests don't belong to DUP politicians but to the electorate who provided a mandate based upon them. Sir Geoffrey Donaldson has united unionism alongside Jim Allister. They both remain faithful to their commitments and have been unwavering in their position. The Acts of Union must be restored. It follows, therefore, that in truth the answer to the Windsor framework is not in fact at all a difficult one for any self-respecting unionist. It does not restore the Acts of Union. Rather, it entrenches the subjugation. Therefore, anyone who endorses the deal is complicit in the subjugation of that which, in a legal sense, is the Union. There is the potential that the Windsor framework's component parts could be restructured in order to fit them within a constitutionally appropriate framework. That's a small but yet fundamental step. A step, however, which offers the Prime Minister the prize of being able to arrive at a position whereby he has a deal which can truly command majority support in unionism as well as nationalism. The Windsor framework must be rejected, however, if the game's still on, and I believe it is. The component parts need not all be dispensed with. They can be restructured and placed within a constitutionally acceptable framework. And from Roderick Murray, also from Newsletter, Windsor framework absolutely not a split in DUP, insists Sir Geoffrey Donaldson. Sir Geoffrey Donaldson has said there is absolutely not a split in his party over the Windsor framework. Speaking on BBC Radio Ulster, the DUP leader said the party would assess the legal text before coming to a collective conclusion. Let me be clear. Our party officers, our assembly members, our members of parliament, and ultimately our party executive will determine the party's approach on this issue, he said. We'll consult and we'll take our time. We'll talk to the people. We'll listen to what people are saying. They'll articulate their views. Of course, there will be diversity and a range of views. People will react in different ways, but the DUP will come to a collective decision on the agreement. When asked how long it would take for the party to reach a conclusion on what had been agreed, he said it will take as long as it takes. We want to get this right. That's the important thing. Rishi Sunak sidestepped questions about how much time he will give the DUP to consider the Windsor framework and what would happen if they reject it, saying he's confident all parties will recognize it gets the balance right for Northern Ireland. People need the time to engage with it, understand it, ask questions, the Prime Minister told reporters during a visit to Coca-Cola plant in Country Antrim. We're going to give them that and answer the questions in the meantime, but I'm confident they'll come to see this for what it is, which is, I think, a historic achievement that gets the balance right for Northern Ireland. He added that time is needed for all parties to understand the Stormont break and that the government wants to work with the team to codify how that's going to work. But he added, we've not been shy about saying I think the people of Northern Ireland need and deserve their government. They need it to be up and running and delivering for them, whether it's in public services or whether it's in taking advantage of the incredible opportunities in the Windsor framework. Prime Minister UUP, or he meets UUP leader Doug Beattie. Ulster Unionist leader Doug Beattie said it was disingenuous for any political party to suggest it would take weeks or months to formulate a response to the Windsor framework. Speaking following a meeting with the Prime Minister in Coantrim, Mr. Beattie said Mr. Sunak had been buoyant. He said, I think the Stormont break is one of those things which sounds good when you talk about it, but as soon as you start delving into it and understanding how it actually works, it throws up more questions than it does answers. But I can see the Prime Minister is working hard to sell this deal, and we still will work hard to scrutinize it. Anyone who's saying this should take weeks and months, I think, is being disingenuous. Any political party should be able to look at this and engage with their party at every level and come up with what they believe to be the outcome, certainly within a week or so. Mr. Beattie said there is no reason why the Stormont power-sharing institutions could not be operating while parties study the detail of the Windsor framework. He said Stormont could be up and running now. You could have an executive now, and at the same time, we could be looking at this framework. You can do that at the same time, but if we drag this out for months, then businesses will be sitting there, not knowing whether they're coming or going. We need to hear from businesses. We need to know if it works for them, but there's no point dragging it out. People need to show the courage of their convictions. Look at the deal coming up with your analysis and making your pitch. From BBC News, Northern Ireland Brexit deal number 10 says misunderstandings will be clarified. The Prime Minister is willing to clarify any misunderstandings about how the new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland will work. The Windsor framework was announced on Monday following months of talks. Rishi Sunak's official spokesman said there were misunderstandings about it but didn't clarify what they were. He said the government respected the need to give the Democratic Unionist Party time to look at it. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Boris Johnson criticized the deal. Mr. Johnson agreed the original post-Brexit arrangements for Northern Ireland back in 2019, known as the Northern Ireland Protocol, which created a trade border in the Irish Sea. In a speech in London, he said the new framework was not about taking back control. He said he'd find it very difficult to vote for Mr. Sunak's deal. The new Windsor framework was signed to alter the protocol. It'll mean goods moving from Great Britain, which are staying in Northern Ireland, would use a green lane at Northern Ireland ports, meaning they would face minimal paperwork and no routine physical checks. Goods which are due to travel into the Republic of Ireland would use a red lane, meaning they face custom processes and other checks. Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton Harris is to talk to Northern Ireland's main political parties in the days ahead to assess their reaction to the framework. The DUP is boycotting Northern Ireland's devolved government at Stormont until it concerns about post-Brexit training agreements or arrangements are addressed. So, for the party, they've not said it'll support the framework and that it'll assess, or that it will assess it against its 7 tests before deciding what to do. But on Wednesday night, one of its MPs, Ian Paisley, said he didn't believe it met those tests. Mr. Paisley was speaking in his role as parliamentary chair of the think tank Centre for the Union. It's a think tank which aims to promote the union of the UK through what it describes as working across the political divide and putting forward coherent and convincing arguments. Mr. Johnson directed some of his comments at the DUP leader during his speech. It's not for me to advise Sir Geoffrey. I hope he can find a way of reconciling himself and his party to this outcome and getting back into Stormont, he said. But I'm conscious, and I won't be thanked for saying this, we must clear must be clear about what's really going on. This is not about taking back control. This is the EU graciously unbending to allow us to do what we want in our own country, not by our laws, but by theirs. On Thursday, David Campbell, chairman of the Loyalist Communities Council, said the Prime Minister had mistakenly oversold the deal. He told BBC Northern Ireland's The View he believed there had been some progress on trade issues within the UK, but in terms of the attempt by the Prime Minister to sell the ending of the Irish Sea border and the ending of essentially the sharing of European sovereignty in Northern Ireland, those simply have not been dealt with, he continued. I don't view the negotiations as over by any means. Treasury Ministry Andrew Griffith told a financial service conference in Germany that the Windsor framework was something many said couldn't be done and shows what we can achieve when we put our minds together. He said that as supporting trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland offered sustainable solutions that will be in the UK's economic interest. In financial services, the Treasury stands ready to continue conversations with our European partners on enhancing regulatory cooperation, Mr. Griffith added. What does the New Deal change in practice? Under the Brexit deal, certain goods have to be checked when they enter Northern Ireland from Great Britain. That's the current process. The goods are checked at ports in Northern Ireland on arrival, and they can be moved into the Republic of Ireland once checked. The new plan, the goods are split into two different lanes. Goods destined for Northern Ireland go into the green lane, meaning they wouldn't have to be checked and would require minimal paperwork, and goods destined for Ireland and the EU go into the red lane, and checks are carried out. All right, watch this space. We'll be back with more news after this. Remember, your engagement by way of a like, share, and or subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
is obvious to the most simple-minded that Loci is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your argument strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
The whole notion of
Should have
logic.
respected us. Of course. Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
The whole
Will you
notion
try
of
to understand
logic.
how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I'm chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete.